On a rainy night in November 1971, a man in a black suit walked onto a plane with nothing more than a briefcase. Hours later, he jumped into the freezing darkness with $200,000 in cash and vanished without a trace. Who was he? Where did he go? And how has one of the greatest unsolved crimes in American history baffled the FBI for over 50 years? This is the mystery of D.B. Cooper. It was the evening of November 24, 1971, Thanksgiving Eve. At Portland International Airport, the holiday rush was underway, and most people were focused on traveling home to loved ones. Among the travelers was a man who stood out, not because of anything suspicious, but because of how ordinary he appeared. He was neatly dressed in a black business suit with a white shirt and a thin black tie. He carried only a briefcase and a paper bag, blending seamlessly into the crowd of commuters. This man would later become known as D.B. Cooper, though the name itself was a mistake, an error by reporters that stuck for decades. That night, however, he purchased a one-way ticket under the name Dan Cooper for Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, a short 30-minute trip from Portland to Seattle. It was an everyday flight, carrying just 36 passengers and 6 crew members, nothing unusual. No one could have imagined that within hours it would become one of the most famous unsolved crimes in American history. Cooper boarded the Boeing 727 quietly, slipping into seat 18C near the rear of the aircraft. Witnesses later recalled that he was polite, calm, and even a little reserved. He ordered a bourbon and soda while waiting for takeoff. Nothing about him hinted at danger. He wasn't nervous, he wasn't aggressive, and he wasn't drawing attention to himself. But once the plane was airborne, everything changed. At approximately 3 p.m., Cooper handed a folded note to flight attendant Florence Schaffner. Thinking it was just another businessman trying to flirt, she tucked the note into her pocket without reading it. Cooper leaned closer and whispered in a low, steady voice, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." When Florence opened the note, her heart sunk. In clear block letters it said, "I have a bomb in my briefcase. I want you to sit beside me." Shaken but professional, she did as instructed. Cooper cracked open his briefcase just enough to show her a tangle of red wires, batteries, and cylindrical objects, convincing enough to pass as an improvised explosive device. Whether it was real or not, no one dared to test him. Cooper then laid out his demands calmly, as though he were discussing business over lunch. He wanted $200,000 in cash, delivered in small, unmarked bills. He demanded 4 parachutes, 2 primary chutes, and 2 reserves, ensuring authorities wouldn't dare sabotage them, since it would imply he might force a hostage to jump with him. Lastly, he requested a fuel truck ready in Seattle to refuel the plane for a longer journey. What struck the crew most was not just the demands, but how calm Cooper was. He wasn't panicking, he wasn't shouting, he spoke politely, even adding please and thank you. He allowed passengers to drink and smoke as usual and made no attempt to scare them. In fact, the passengers remained blissfully unaware of the hijacking. They believed they were just experiencing a routine flight delay. As the pilot, Captain William Scott, was informed, the crew quickly radioed the situation to ground control in Seattle. The FBI, airline officials, and local police scrambled to respond. In less than 2 hours, they gathered the money, $200,000 in $20 bills, carefully marked for later tracing, and arranged parachutes. Meanwhile, inside the cabin, Cooper remained almost unnervingly composed. He smoked cigarettes one after another and sipped bourbon as though nothing unusual was happening. Florence, the flight attendant, later said that while he was firm, he was never cruel or reckless. She remembered thinking he wasn't insane, just determined. At 5:46 p.m., the plane landed at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport under Cooper's orders. The passengers, still largely unaware of the full gravity of the situation, were released in exchange for the money and parachutes. Authorities discreetly delivered the ransom and gear onto the plane, careful not to spook him. The exchange went smoothly. Not a single passenger was harmed. Cooper inspected the cash, ensured the parachutes were on board, and then gave the crew new instructions. He wanted the plane refueled and prepared to take off again. His next destination? He ordered the pilots to head south toward Mexico, but with strict flight conditions. Fly at 10,000 feet, keep the speed slow, and most importantly, keep the rear staircase unlocked and lowered. The pilots knew these demands were highly unusual. Commercial jets were never flown under those conditions. It was inefficient, risky, and completely outside standard procedure. But Cooper wasn't bargaining. He was in control, and the crew had no choice but to obey. By 7:40 p.m., the Boeing 727 once again lifted off into the stormy night, carrying only 5 people now, Cooper and the 4 crew members. The passengers were safe on the ground, but the real mystery, the part that would puzzle investigators for the next half-century, was just beginning. At that moment, no one knew that they were witnessing the start of one of America's greatest legends, the skyjacking of D.B. Cooper, a man who seemed to step out of thin air and would soon vanish back into it. The Boeing 727 sliced through the stormy skies over Washington state. Rain lashed against the fuselage, and strong headwinds buffeted the aircraft as it pushed southward. Inside the dimly lit cabin, the tension was palpable. Though the passengers were gone, the remaining crew sat in stunned silence, forced to comply with the orders of the man who had hijacked their plane, D.B. Cooper. Cooper had been specific, even meticulous in his instructions. The plane was to fly south toward Mexico at a low altitude of about 10,000 feet, with the landing gear down and the cabin depressurized. The unusual request puzzled the pilots, but they soon realized what Cooper was planning. These were the exact conditions needed for a parachute jump from a commercial airliner. As the aircraft rumbled through the night, Cooper sat calmly near the rear, smoking cigarette after cigarette and sipping what remained of his bourbon. He seemed utterly at ease, even as the storm intensified outside. Flight attendant Tina Mucklow, the last crew member seated near him, recalled that he was polite but distant, focused entirely on the task at hand. He checked the parachutes carefully, examined the bundles of cash strapped into a bag, and prepared for what he clearly knew would be the most dangerous part of his plan. At around 8 p.m., Cooper suddenly instructed Tina to move into the cockpit with the other crew members and close the door. From that moment onward, he was alone in the main cabin of the jet. The crew, sealed off at the front, could only guess what he was doing. A few minutes later, a warning light in the cockpit signaled that the rear staircase was being lowered. This was the very feature that had made the Boeing 727 unique, the rear air stair, designed for ground boarding at smaller airports. It was rarely used in flight, but Cooper had clearly studied the plane's design and knew it was possible. The pilots immediately radioed back to air traffic control. "He's deploying the air stair." But there was nothing they could do. They had to maintain course and speed exactly as ordered. At 8:13 p.m., somewhere over the dense forests of southwestern Washington, the crew felt a sudden shift. The tail of the plane jolted upward slightly, as though the aircraft had just been relieved of a great weight. It was brief but distinct. Many believe this was the exact moment when D.B. Cooper leapt from the rear staircase into the storm below, vanishing into darkness with $200,000 strapped to his body and 2 parachutes on hand. The risks he faced were staggering. Outside, the weather was brutal. heavy rain, freezing winds, and pitch-black night. The terrain below was some of the most rugged wilderness in the Pacific Northwest: thick forests, rivers, mountains, and almost no open ground. Even expert paratroopers wouldn't have attempted such a jump under those conditions, yet Cooper seemed to do it without hesitation. The crew, still sealed in the cockpit, had no direct confirmation of his jump. They kept flying south for another hour, waiting for any signal, but there was nothing. No movement in the cabin, no demands, no sound. Just the endless roar of the engines and the rain hammering against the windows. Finally, around 10:15 p.m., the plane landed safely in Reno, Nevada, where FBI agents and law enforcement swarmed the jet. With weapons drawn, they stormed the cabin, bracing for confrontation. But the rear was empty. The staircase hung open, and the hijacker was gone. Only a few traces remained: Cooper's black tie, a mother-of-pearl tie clip, and 8 filter-tipped cigarettes crushed into the armrest ashtray. News of his disappearance spread like wildfire. How had he managed to leap from a jetliner mid-air, in the middle of a storm, and simply vanish? Had he survived the jump, or had the wilderness swallowed him whole? Search efforts began immediately. Over the following weeks, FBI agents, state police, and even military helicopters scoured the suspected drop zone, roughly 18 square miles of rugged forest near the Lewis River in Washington. Teams of men trudged through mud, rivers, and thick brush looking for any sign of a parachute, a body, or the missing money. Yet, despite one of the most intensive searches in FBI history, nothing was found. No Cooper, no parachutes, no cash, not even footprints. The possibility that he had perished seemed obvious. How could anyone survive that jump? But at the same time, the total lack of evidence was baffling. If he had died, surely something would have turned up: a body tangled in trees, a parachute snagged in the forest canopy, or the bag of cash washed up along the river. Yet year after year, the wilderness gave up no clues. As the FBI pieced together the timeline, they realized how bold and how mysterious Cooper truly was. He hadn't just leapt into the night blindly, he had planned it meticulously: the choice of aircraft, the parachutes, the ransom, even the holiday timing when banks carried extra cash. His knowledge of aviation suggested either a military background or professional training, and his calm composure hinted at a man who wasn't acting out of desperation, but rather executing a long-prepared scheme. The legend of D.B. Cooper was born that night, a man who had defied the authorities, stolen a fortune, and then vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but questions. Had he drowned in the swollen rivers? Had he crashed into the trees? Or had he walked away in triumph, disappearing into a new life under a new identity? For the crew, the experience was surreal. Tina Mucklow would later say that while she feared for her life, Cooper never struck her as cruel or unstable. He was polite, controlled, and almost professional, as though he was performing a job, one that he intended to finish no matter the odds. The FBI, meanwhile, realized they were facing a nightmare: a criminal who had left virtually no evidence and who might never be seen again. The search in the forests of Washington eventually tapered off, but the mystery only grew. Each unanswered question fed the legend, and each year that passed without resolution only deepened the myth of the man who jumped into darkness and disappeared forever. By the time the 1970s ended, the world had moved on from many events, but the story of D.B. Cooper remained alive in the public imagination. The man in the black suit who walked onto a plane with a briefcase and walked, perhaps parachuted, into history, was still out there, somewhere, cloaked in mystery. That night in November 1971 had changed aviation security forever and left behind one of the greatest unsolved cases in American history. The morning after the hijacking, the United States awoke to shocking headlines. Air pirate parachutes into storm with $200,000. Newspapers ran the story coast to coast. For the FBI, this wasn't just another crime. This was an unprecedented challenge. No one had ever pulled off a hijacking like this before, and no one had ever disappeared so completely. From the very beginning, the FBI's investigation, codenamed Hijack, short for Northwest Hijacking, became one of the largest and most exhaustive in the Bureau's history. Dozens of agents were assigned to the case. They started with the only hard evidence Cooper had left behind: his black tie, the tie clip, and 8 cigarette butts. These were sent to the FBI lab for fingerprint analysis. Surprisingly, no clear prints could be lifted. It was as if Cooper had taken precautions to remain untraceable. Witness descriptions from the crew painted a consistent picture: a man in his mid-40s, around 6 feet tall, olive or light complexion, with dark hair and a calm, authoritative voice. But even with sketches circulated nationwide, no confirmed identity emerged. The FBI began sifting through flight manifests, parachute records, and even military personnel files, hoping to find someone who matched the description and had the expertise to pull off such a stunt. They interviewed thousands of suspects, literally anyone reported as boasting about the hijacking or showing sudden, unexplained wealth. For months, the forests of Washington and Oregon were combed again and again. Army troops, police, volunteers, and FBI agents searched on foot, by air, and even by boat along the Columbia River. Nothing surfaced. It was as though the wilderness had swallowed D.B. Cooper whole. Then came the theories. The FBI considered 2 main possibilities. Either Cooper had perished in the jump, or he had somehow survived and escaped into anonymity. The survival theory seemed improbable. The conditions had been deadly: nighttime, heavy rain, freezing temperatures, and rugged terrain. To make matters worse, Cooper had jumped in a business suit, dress shoes, and a trench coat, hardly survival gear. Even expert skydivers said the odds of surviving such a leap were close to 0. Yet the lack of evidence for his death was puzzling. If Cooper had indeed died, surely something, parachute fabric, a body, or even scattered bills, would have been found in the search. The complete absence of physical traces kept the survival theory alive. Over the years, several suspects emerged as leading contenders. One was Richard Floyd McCoy, a Vietnam veteran and skydiving enthusiast who staged a nearly identical hijacking just months later in 1972. McCoy boarded a United Airlines flight, demanded $500,000, and parachuted out with the ransom. He was later caught and sentenced to prison. Many believed he could have been Cooper, or at least inspired by him, but the FBI dismissed the connection. McCoy's description, methods, and evidence tied him only to his own crime. Another was Duane Weber, a man who confessed on his deathbed in 1995 that he was D.B. Cooper. His wife later claimed he had nightmares about leaving fingerprints on an aircraft, and once told her he had a knee injury from jumping out of a plane. While intriguing, DNA evidence from the tie did not match Weber, and the FBI could not corroborate his story. Perhaps the most famous suspect was Robert Rackstraw, a former Army pilot with a checkered past and a history of fraud. Investigators and journalists linked him to the crime for decades, pointing to his military training and cryptic comments he made later in life. A documentary even suggested that coded messages from Cooper's letters matched his style. Yet the FBI ultimately ruled him out due to lack of evidence. Dozens of other names surfaced: ex-convicts, ex-paratroopers, even a railroad worker who vanished after payday. Each time, the FBI ran down leads, compared fingerprints, and tried to tie suspects to the crime. Each time, the case went cold. In 1980, a potential breakthrough electrified the case. A young boy camping with his family along the Columbia River unearthed rotting bundles of $20 bills buried in the sand. The serial numbers matched Cooper's ransom money. It was the first and only physical evidence ever recovered from the hijacking. But it only deepened the mystery. How had the money ended up there, partially decomposed yet still bundled in rubber bands? Had it washed downstream from where Cooper landed? Or had someone buried it deliberately to mislead investigators? The location didn't match the suspected flight path, adding yet another riddle to the case. Theories multiplied. Some believed Cooper had drowned in the river, with only a portion of the money washing ashore years later. Others argued that he had staged the burial himself, a red herring to throw investigators off his trail. By the 1990s, the Cooper case had achieved legendary status. Amateur sleuths, retired detectives, and even writers obsessed over the mystery. Theories ranged from the plausible to the bizarre. Cooper was a CIA operative. Cooper was a disgruntled Boeing employee. Cooper was a ghost of the Cold War. Each idea gained traction in magazines, TV specials, and later internet forums. But the FBI was less amused. Despite decades of work, the Bureau had no solid answers. In 2016, 45 years after the hijacking, the FBI officially closed the case, stating that resources were better spent elsewhere. But they acknowledged that D.B. Cooper remained the only hijacker in U.S. history never to be caught or confirmed dead. To this day, the investigation leaves behind a series of haunting contradictions. Cooper's plan was both reckless and brilliant. His chances of survival were slim, yet his execution was near flawless. The evidence suggested he had planned every detail, yet not a single trace of him ever surfaced after that night. And perhaps the greatest irony of all? While countless hijackers have been caught, tried, and forgotten, it is D.B. Cooper's vanishing act that turned him into an enduring legend. More than half a century has passed since that stormy night in November 1971, yet the mystery of D.B. Cooper continues to grip the imagination of people all over the world. Few crimes in modern history have transcended their facts to become folklore, and Cooper's case is one of them. His story is no longer just about an unsolved hijacking. It is about what he came to symbolize: the perfect outlaw who defied the system and disappeared without a trace. From the very beginning, Cooper's audacity captured the public's fascination. He didn't fit the image of a violent criminal. Witnesses described him as polite, calm, even gentlemanly. He ordered a drink, tipped the stewardess generously with instructions to keep calm, and never harmed a single passenger. While hijackers before and after him threatened chaos or demanded political concessions, Cooper's crime was strangely clean and almost theatrical. That paradox, dangerous yet composed, reckless yet refined, cemented his place in the cultural imagination. As the decades passed, the legend of Cooper grew larger than the case itself. Movies, novels, and even songs immortalized him as the mysterious outlaw who vanished into thin air. The hijacking inspired characters in films like Without a Paddle and references in shows like Prison Break and Loki. Rock bands wrote songs about him. Authors used his name as shorthand for mystery. For many, D.B. Cooper became a kind of American anti-hero, a Robin Hood figure who outsmarted the authorities and vanished into the night sky. But behind the romance lies the human cost. The passengers on Flight 305 lived through a terrifying ordeal. For hours they sat in fear, unsure if the man beside them would suddenly detonate the bomb in his briefcase. Flight attendants, though praised for their bravery, never forgot the tension of that night. And for investigators who worked tirelessly for decades, the lack of closure was deeply frustrating. To them, Cooper wasn't a legend, he was a criminal who put lives at risk and walked away unpunished. The discovery of the ransom money in 1980 only deepened the intrigue. It reignited public interest, fueled documentaries, and spurred amateur sleuths to pore over maps, river flow data, and wilderness survival guides. Even today, new theories continue to emerge online. Some believe the money was planted. Others insist Cooper drowned, and the discovery proves it. The fact that no additional bills from the ransom ever appeared in circulation is itself a haunting clue. Did Cooper stash the money elsewhere? Did he never spend it? Or was the remainder destroyed? The case also reshaped aviation security. In the 1970s, hijackings were alarmingly common, and Cooper's stunt highlighted just how vulnerable air travel was. In response, the FAA and airlines quickly implemented stricter boarding procedures, mandatory passenger screening, and later metal detectors. Most famously, aircraft were retrofitted with the Cooper vane, a mechanical device that prevents rear staircases from being opened during flight. This simple invention was a direct legacy of the hijacking, ensuring that no one could repeat Cooper's daring escape. Despite these reforms, the mystery itself remains unresolved, and perhaps that is why it endures. Every few years, a new book, documentary, or podcast revisits the case, each claiming to have the missing piece. Retired FBI agents occasionally grant interviews, hinting at suspects they still find compelling. Amateur detectives create elaborate timelines, analyze the ransom bills, or even try to replicate Cooper's jump. The case has become not just a crime, but a collaborative puzzle that spans generations. In 2016, when the FBI officially closed the case, the Bureau admitted what the public already knew: D.B. Cooper had beaten them. By then, most of the original investigators had retired or passed away, leaving behind thousands of documents, hundreds of interviews, and still no definitive answers. The decision to close the file only fueled speculation that the truth might never be known. And maybe that's exactly why the story survives. If Cooper had been caught within days, he would have been just another hijacker, lost in the archives of criminal history. If his body had been found in the wilderness, his name would have faded into a cautionary tale. But because he vanished, because he left only questions, he became a legend. Today, Cooper isn't just a case file. He is a cultural riddle, a story told around campfires, classrooms, and online forums. Was he a desperate man on the run? A skilled operative who knew exactly what he was doing? Or just a gambler who got incredibly lucky? The lack of answers ensures that each generation reimagines him in their own way. What lingers most is the image of that final moment. A man in a suit, standing at the edge of the Boeing 727's rear stairway, wind howling, money strapped to his chest, and the storm below. With a final step, he vanished into darkness. Did he find freedom? Did he meet his death? No one can say. And maybe that's the way Cooper intended it all along. For the FBI, the hijacking remains an unsolved crime. For the public, it remains an enduring mystery. And for history, D.B. Cooper has become something far more, an icon of the unknown. And so, more than 50 years later, the question still hangs in the air. Who was D.B. Cooper, and what became of him after that leap into the storm? Until that question is answered, the legend of D.B. Cooper will never die.